Hello and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Oliver Crofton and I shall be the host for today's session. I'm really pleased to be joined by two fantastic panelists where I'm going to be asking them some very pertinent questions about today's subject. So we're looking forward to the session. Just to give you a quick overview of what we'll be covering and who's here, and I will come back to them to let them introduce themselves, but we're delighted to have Craig Lusher, who is a principal product architect at Continent 8. We have Joe Joyce, who is the partner and head of regulatory and digital at Taylor Wessing, and obviously myself, I work within the cybersecurity team at Continent 8 Technologies. Today's session is very much an informative discussion, as I mentioned. It's not salesy, so if you do want to pick up with any questions with us during the session, please highlight them in the Q&A button within the webinar app, and I'll try and weave questions in as we go along to the discussion as we flow through. But also, if I can't do that, I'll pick up any other questions towards the end. Today's topic is around NIS2 and the EU Cyber Resilience Act. Now, regulatory changes have been quite rapid within the data protection security world. A lot of us have still got recollections and nightmares around the GDPR changes that came into place a few years ago, and that momentum has continued. And within the iGaming space particularly, there are reasons why iGaming companies fall within NIS2 and the Cyber Resilience Act, and we will pick those up today, discuss what they mean for the industry and what you can do to ensure that you are protected against regulation, but also within the evolving threats across the cybersecurity landscape. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now and go into asking our brilliant panelists to do a quick introduction themselves. Joe, I'm going to start with you, if that's all right. We've done a few webinars in the past together, and I've been on a few as well watching you. So I know that you know your stuff. I'm really pleased to have you here. If you could give us a quick introduction about who you are, what you do, and what you know about NIS2 and the Cyber Resilience Act.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you very much, Oliver. Yeah, I love a webinar, me too. Yeah, many of you may have seen me before. I lead the regulatory IP and digital team for Taylor Wessing in Ireland, in Dublin. Although, as you can tell from the accent, I snuck over from the UK. So I'm also keeping a fair eye on some of the UK-based regulations that will not exactly align with NIS2 and the CRA, but are also going to be relevant, and we'll probably touch on what UK businesses need to be worried about as well, because they can't take their eye off the ball here either. As you know, Oliver, I do a lot of work helping businesses of all sorts, so across lots of different sectors, but with a real focus on kind of tech, and iGaming is one of my focuses, working around both the breach and security incident preparedness, and that means compliance activities in relation to NIS2 and the CRA in particular, but also quite practical things around how do you not just how do you get your paperwork in order and meet your registration requirements and all those things, but how do you compile the right team, how do you actually prepare for an incident, and a big part of my work is supporting businesses and organizations that are experiencing cybersecurity incidents. So that's often a big scary ransomware incident, but it might also be an insider threat, a rogue employee. There are lots of different ways in which we can find our security compromised. So I get to see it at both ends of the cycle, which is exciting for me, even if no one's ever really pleased to see me when they have to dial into a call with me.
Yeah, I have. We worked together on a few of those cases, Joe, and I know it's a much calmer and more enjoyable experience before an incident happens when you're planning and preparing. Thanks for that, Joe. Really pleased to have you here. Move on to Craig Lusher, my colleague at Continent 8. Craig, could you give me a quick overview of who you are and what you do at CA?
Sure. So my name is Craig Lusher, and I'm the Principal Solutions Architect for EMEA at Continent 8. Recently moved out of a more security-centric role, where we help businesses with managed security solutions, VAPTs and professional services, and looking to really make sure that technology investments actually drive business value rather than just sticking them in for the hell of it. So this is one spot with NIST with NIS2 and CRA. Obviously, this is one spot where technology absolutely needs to be in place for to drive that value. And yeah, looking forward to discussing.
Great, thanks, Craig. Really, really pleased to have you join me today for this discussion. So, to kick us off, to get a high-level overview of NIS2 and the EU Cyber Resilience Act, Joe, can I go to you first? Just give us an overview of what these regulations involve, what's the core premise, and a bit of why they were introduced. If you could start us off there, it would be really helpful.
Yeah, of course. Well, I'll start with why, and I think everything else flows from that probably, Oliver. So I think a lot of our listeners and viewers will know that there's pre-existing legislation in the context of cyber resilience for some critical sectors and areas already, the NIS directive. And NIS2 is kind of the sexy sequel. It does what it says on the tin. It's coming here to update and replace our pre-existing regime. The original NIS was brought in 2016, and I would say, thinking about my own career, I was sort of practicing law for about 5 years at that point, and I was starting to see kind of more interesting cybersecurity incidents popping up. And in the past 10 years, things have completely revolutionized. The sheer volume of incidents, the scale of them, the sophistication, the variety, the different sort of vectors and ways in which people can find themselves compromised, the vast shift in terms of we're also interconnected. We're all very heavily reliant on specific vendors and providers of services, to the point that when I was a solicitor, I could have done my job without the internet. Not for very long, but for a few days. I could have handwritten a letter if I'd had to. In the past 10 years, we've got to we're all dependent on our supply chains, and supply chain vulnerability is very much one of the factors that's made the European Union decide we really need to update this. So NIS2 introduces more sectors that are considered critical and important. It really focuses on that supply chain point, and I think one of the things that I've noticed is that in the past decade, it's in a sense a good thing that we don't have the same stigma attached to, say, big cybersecurity attacks that we used to. But at the same time, it's almost become a bit of a rite of passage. There's almost a view that it's just the cost of doing business, that it happens to everyone. You can't really prevent it. I think one of the things that the EU is trying to do here is to say, no, you can and you should. And even if you can't prevent things, you can make them much better. You can mitigate the harm. And they really want to see consistent standards across the EU in terms of how firms that are considered critical or important to the operation of the EU market handle that. The Cyber Resilience Act, similar themes and similar ideas, but again, the sheer volume of devices, IoT devices, apps are captured. A lot of people think the CRA is all about physical devices, but digital applications can also be captured. Humans in the EU are very dependent upon this kind of technology in a way that they weren't a few years ago. So we really need to ensure that people's lives aren't massively disrupted, that their well-being, their safety, their health, isn't hindered because something they rely upon is compromised or ceases to be maintained after a couple of years after it's on the market. The CRA is very much about making sure that consumers have the right to expect that if you've been sold something, that it's going to be kept secure, it's going to be maintained, and you're going to be able to continue using it safely for a decent period of time.
Interesting. And what people on this webinar, the attendees that have come from lots of different countries and operate across jurisdictions. Obviously, this is slightly more of an EU-centric session, but what jurisdictions do these regulations cover?
So directly, and I should say the CRA is a regulation, so it just applies. It took effect when the EU passed it. Member states didn't need to do anything, although many of them will. NIS2 is a bit more complicated because it's a directive, and so you have to have local implementing legislation. We mostly have that now. A few countries, including Ireland, awkwardly for me, haven't quite yet got round to it, and hopefully will soon. But we know that those 27 member states are directly impacted. We also expect that Norway, Iceland, Liechtenstein, which generally adopt EU legislation on behalf, will do so too, with slightly varying timescales. But it's absolutely the case that if you're providing services that are court, if you are service providers into the EU, then you're going to have to abide by these conditions. The sort of whether or not you are actually based and fully operational in the European Union. We're also likely to see that even if you are a UK business that's primarily servicing UK customers, you're probably going to start aligning with this stuff, because even if you have a handful of customers and say the Republic of Ireland, you still have to meet those same standards. You might have to start CE marking your products, your digital products in the context of the CRA. There are all sorts of things that can get you into pretty deep water if you don't comply. So there's going to be duties on those companies, some of which are not necessarily expecting them. And then also, we're expecting to see what we call the Brussels effect. So, this is pretty robust legislation. It sets a good benchmark. It applies across a large number of countries. So, if you are in Australia, the US, Canada, and you are thinking, well, do I just apply these standards to everything? The answer is often yes.
I'm just going to pick up on a point, which I'm going to move to you, Craig, just to get your thoughts on this. Joe mentioned a data or system breach is often seen as a cost of doing business. How has the cyber threat landscape changed specifically for iGaming, and how are these regulatory changes reflecting what we're seeing within, or is it reflecting what we're seeing across the threat landscape?
Yeah, sure. So obviously, cost of doing business and the fact that some fraudulent elements are kind of in all P&L kind of models that exist, it's expected that something will happen, and it's about kind of looking at that over an annualized period to try and work out what that would be. But when we see, stats like a 400% surge in cyber incidents affecting casino operators and gambling businesses since kind of 2024, you see that it's not just a gradual trend. This 4 times multiplier. You can see attackers have actually industrialized their approach, and it's an organized business now, with obviously the tools like AI, etc., that exist out there, becoming more professional and more robust. And it's not just kind of scripts that are being kicked off to try and take down big enterprises. Actually, targeted attacks with credential stuffing and account takeovers, of which we've also seen a 42% surge as well recently. The cost of downtime, especially for iGaming and sports, right? Imagine the Grand National or Super Bowl, World Cup. These events, cost of downtime exceeds the $6,000 per minute kind of territory. So, keeping online and keeping active is the prerogative of these companies. And obviously, if they go down, it can cost a lot of money, right? So it's about stopping that. There's been some recent large breaches as well, where I'm not going to mention names, but it's publicly available information. 800,000 user profiles in a big sports betting platform got taken, with IP addresses, betting activities exposed, and that could almost be kind of like blackmail territory, where you'll be able to identify users and be able to potentially blackmail them. It's that personal of detail that's coming through. There's another European group that had 70,000 ID scans compromised through a misconfigured AWS S3 backend. So it was an interface problem and a misconfiguration, but that basic error, had a catastrophic result, basically. Back in Europe again, there was 1.7 million euros lost in a 48-hour period through account takeovers as well. And attackers worldwide are sharing tools and selling exploits on the dark web. And obviously, these guys traditionally tried to work in silos. Now they're sharing, they're using their core skills and kind of collaborating with other attackers that may be skilled in a different area, and kind of combining forces. And obviously with AI being widespread, deep fakes on KYC videos, automated intrusion, real-time adaption, all of this kind of stuff is moving forward this year as of now. So EU, voluntary measured voluntary measures were no longer suitable given the sufficient scale of this escalation, and that's why mandatory kind of NIS2 controls have been put in place to kind of supersede what was already there. The ship it and forget it culture within software products, where they released products with known vulnerabilities that were never patched, that's all gone now. And you know, these new directives are much about accountability as they are anything else.
Is that a key part of NIS2 around accountability of how good your software product is? Because I have worked across software development for most of my life, and 10, 15 years ago, we were literally shipping stuff. You know, I think the mantra was, if you're not embarrassed by the first version of the software, you launch too late. Has that changed, Craig? Do you see that that's adapting with tech teams now?
I mean, it has to. So it's a directive now. So I'm sure we'll come on to it later. But you know, SBOM is something that the EU legislation has dropped, and that is going to cover every single aspect of what iGaming platforms and iGaming software providers, slot machines, casino games, anything that's kind of makes up that game. Whether it's proprietary component or whether it's open source or particular library that's used, all of that needs to be identified now. And you need to almost have an ingredients list for your software that you're shipping. So that is completely new. Yes.
That brings us on nicely to the next question for you, Joe. Just to unpick that, because there are very few gaming operators that own and operate the whole stack of their ecosystem, the different layers and third parties involved. Who is actually in scope within the iGaming ecosystem? Is it platforms, operators, suppliers? How's that reflected in the legislation?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I've spotted is quite a lot of you know, operators and firms within the iGaming kind of ecosystem haven't really necessarily accepted that they're in scope. I think, to be honest, I think it's also worth flagging that in the context of the CRA, so where we're talking about sort of software applications potentially, people are also thinking, well, I didn't, you know, I basically, you know, if you're doing something whereby you're not just providing your product as a service, but you're actually providing any element of infrastructure to another parties or other parts of the ecosystem, you're going to be caught. And there's no kind of de minimis threshold under the CRA, so it doesn't matter if there are only 4 of you in your organization, you still have to go through, you know, all of the assessments. You know, you have to decide, do I need to do, what kind of conformity assessments do I have to do, because there are like 3 different layers. There's a whole load of stuff that I think a lot of people think, well, we're just too small to be caught, or, well, you know, nowhere in the CRA or in NIS2 does it actually reference iGaming or online gambling. These aren't critical sectors, and actually I think the sort of the selling and the marketing of the legislation has slightly done itself a disservice by actually not, you need to remind people, you might think you're a gaming company, but you're actually an ICT provider. If you know, you don't need to be, that doesn't need to be your primary business. That, you know, you might make a lot of money, you know, selling, you know, with your own kind of gambling operations, but if you are sub-licensing something that you've developed to another party, you know, and it could be quite a small aspect of how a platform's operated, but you've done it best, so other people are licensing from you, you're going to fall into scope. You know, if you are providing payment services, or, you know, you are supporting payment services, you might be in scope not only under NIS2 but actually also under its fun cousin legislation, DORA, the Digital Operational Resilience Act, which is a whole other webinar. But there's, you know, it is very much the case that if you're operating on that sort of basis, then you at least need to ask the question, you at least need to really assess your services. And I also think that there's a slight risk within some of the larger operators that things, you know, there are sort of separate work streams, there are separate revenue, you know, income streams coming in that are maybe quite a small part of the overall bottom line of the organization, but in terms of these chunks of legislation, they create a significant new risk, and because they're not the primary source of revenue for the business, you know, they've not really been thought about. And because obviously also because iGaming is a kind of a risk-heavy sector, heavily regulated sector, but where we're used to thinking about different types of risk. You know, a lot of the time the cybersecurity risk has been sort of pigeonholed, and everyone says, well, that's the IT team's problem. Occasionally that's legal's problem, but mostly that's an IT team problem. That's all about how resilient are we, and not accepting that no, actually we now have an obligation for the resilience of people that we're sub-licensing something we've developed to. So it's really hard to say, you know, if you're producing a kiosk or a terminal or something else that's you know, an IoT product that could, you know, sit in a physical casino or in a pub, it's kind of obvious that that's going to fall into the CRA category. But there are lots of other things that you could be doing that could bring you into scope of either NIS2 or the CRA, and you really just have to do a bit of an audit of your services and say, if we're not simply developing our own stuff and selling our own stuff directly to consumers, if that's not all we're doing, then we're probably caught. If we're big enough, we're probably using, you know, we might have you know, be subletting rack space in a data center, in which case we have to factor in, you know, are we caught in that context in NIS2? So there are multiple ways in which, even though iGaming itself is not a sector, you could be leaking into other sectors quite easily. It's a far more fluid ecosystem now than it was a few years ago, and people have to respect that.
Yeah,
how do you go about doing it in terms of mapping out across your organization to identify potentially very small departments that have sold part of your software elsewhere? Because you know, it's an attractive thing to do, and a lot of companies do that. How do you go about auditing for that?
Hopefully you have a register of licenses that you've issued. You know, the legal team is often the first point of call. They may have been involved in actually doing the paperwork around this, and I've had a couple of conversations with heads of legal or general counsels where I've said, you know, that document that I worked on for you 3 years ago, I think that brings you in the scope of NIS2. And they've gone, no, it doesn't. And then they phoned me back 3 days later and said, oh, I think it does. So I'd say having a chat with the legal team is a good place to start. Having a chat with product development teams, anyone that's doing anything a little bit niche, anything that's a little bit R&D within the business, where they might be pairing up with third parties, there might be collaborations. If you drill into a collaboration, it might turn out that actually you know, there's a service line there, and you might each be providing the other license services, but then everyone's falling into scope because the law doesn't really differentiate between, you know, what kind of service provider we're talking about and what kind of supply chain relationship it is. If other businesses within the sector or broadly, you know, online are reliant upon something that you're doing, in terms of an infrastructure or a platform provision, then you're going to be caught. So someone will know about it somewhere, but it might be that you need to have a chat with your R&D and legal teams to make sure that you've not missed something.
Potentially a helpful point within this too is that it does place more emphasis on management accountability. So this is going to come from the top, right? So what does that mean for senior leadership teams, CISOs and compliance teams, Joe, in terms of getting senior management involved in these issues?
Yeah, it's a bit of a sea change. For a long time, lawyers have been sort of saying, well, you know, you're a director, you have a liability, and, you know, particularly, you know, under kind of English or Irish or common law, that's sort of generally accepted to be the case, but it's not specific enough, it's not tied enough, there's no immediate penalty. You know, you know, if you've done something terrible, you might eventually get a slap on the wrist, but it's all been very, you know, sort of ephemeral, and management groups that have overseen some really shocking underinvestment kind of examples, or situations where the advice of the CISO or the DPO has been completely ignored. There's rarely any penalty. So this is a big shift. As well as the significant fines, you know, you can be fined up to 10 million euro or 2% of turnover for a serious NIS2 violation. In addition to that, the personal liability of the management group, the board of directors, is a big departure, and it does mean that you know, as part of that, the CISO has to, or their team, whoever is leading on information security, has to have direct access to the board. The board has to effectively submit to training, because it won't be a defense to say, I delegated that to somebody else. You don't get to delegate that. You don't have to be an expert, but you have to have commissioned the right reporting from your team, undertaken sufficient training so that at a high level you could understand the type of risks that you are signing off on. And if you do all of those things, then that will be a defense. Just because something bad has happened doesn't mean that you're necessarily at fault. As we've already said, threat actors are very sophisticated, but if there has been underinvestment, there hasn't been training, this will be a problem. So in a sense, this is often very good for CISOs and for their teams, because actually the attention that they've craved at board level for a long time, they'll be listened to, they'll get investment, people will have to actually if you provide a report to the board that says these are key areas and where we are at risk of this is what we need to do about it, and they don't at least do some of it, they are going to be in a really tricky position later. The downside is that you do have to, as a CISO, you can't just, if you've been one of those lucky people that's sort of been able to do what you want and you've had the budget you wanted, and you haven't really had to deal with management too much because they were like, oh, we don't really understand, we'll leave it to you. That's not going to work anymore. You are going to have to produce reasonable reporting in layman's terms often, or near to layman's terms. You are going to have to work out how to communicate very complicated ideas to some people who are perhaps quite happy to absorb risk a lot of the time, and explain to them that we're operating in different risk parameters here. So I think if you're a CISO, it's probably good news for you, but you are going to have to change the way you work.
I saw Craig nodding very vigorously during that update, Joe, for you on the shared responsibility. Craig, have you seen that being done well in the past? Because I know over the last 10, 15 years, we've grown up in an industry where IT has changed. It's no longer that's IT's problem. Now that's a business problem. Cybersecurity is a business problem. How have you seen teams work effectively with senior management, and what processes or ways of working have you seen to be effective?
Yeah, so obviously, this directive very much means that security is in everybody's hands right now, and there's accountability for that, right? So it's about ensuring that the business is all singing off the same hymn sheet. There is training right the way through, and in fact, it's mandatory for board level staff as well. But you've got to keep training and constant training at the very tip of what you're doing. Humans and the way that we work, we're infallible, right? There's always going to be some faults that we do, so we need to make sure that we are equipped with what we need to kind of make sure we don't become the weakest link in that chain. Obviously, there's very many, as we've mentioned before, like iGaming specifically is very interconnected, and working within a business obviously is one move, but working with other businesses as well, because this new law brings in a trickle-down effect. So essentially, the weakest link, so for example, if an operator is working with that they might have kind of 5 to 6 payment gateways, some live odds feeds, might work with 20 to 50 game studio integrations, affiliation systems, CRM, might have some aggregators baked in there somewhere as well. And maybe they work with a small independent game studio, for example. That small independent game studio that doesn't really have a security team can actually compromise the major operator. So what we're seeing with this new governance and law is that trickle-down effect will affect that small studio. So if you work with a bigger operator, the buck is actually on the operator's side, and the operator becomes responsible for that small independent game studio's security, essentially. So it's white labeling and B2B. We've mentioned this as well. Often seen as managed service providers without realizing it, and NIS2 automatically classifies them as such, potentially becoming essential entities under NIS2, which would mean that platform providers would have some very strict rules that are being put in place with supply chain security, and it's all about kind of making sure that everybody realizes if you're supplying to a big provider or a big operator, you also come under the same rules as them as well.
And on that point, Craig, how should responsibility for security and resilience be shared between operators and critical suppliers or hosting partners? How are you seeing discussions with clients now from a content perspective? What kind of questions would you expect to see from your clients?
Sure. So, I mean, you can outsource the work, but you can't outsource the risk, is what we're seeing now, right? So, the operator remains the custodian of the final outcome. And as we mentioned just now, modern gaming platforms are a patchwork of third-party components. And, operator doesn't control the internal security of any of those parts. So it's all about vetting suppliers. It's all about doing vulnerability tests, all about assessing providers' cyber maturity levels and making sure that there's no backdoors. Essential operators, as classified, must vet every supplier that they use, and that trickle-down effect does come into scope here as well. So it includes B2B platforms, CDN providers, as I mentioned, CRM providers, API providers, odds feeds, payment gateways. All of these services that underpin operators and multiple operators, even down to the small companies, can be swept under this essential entity in the classification that NIS2 brings out. Malta also goes a little bit, just to kind of make this point here as well. Malta, in gaming, all roads lead to Malta, right? And they actually add further pressure onto this as well, because if you are classified as a platform provider or have a strong dependence on, or other companies strongly depend on you, you actually have to have a 24/7 SOC requirement. And the self-registration has already passed for them, the September 25, and government controls actually have to be in place by March 26. So, the ultimate sanction of NGA license suspension is the threat here. So, we're seeing companies that are operating with B2B companies and white label companies and service providers actually, have to have a 24/7 staff as SOC, which needs to be run by 12 staff at least, or it's outsourced. So, you have to work with partners, especially if you're a small company.
Well, that's a huge investment for firms on the smaller side. If you're a small supplier to a big organization, that's quite often game studios are not more than 12 people themselves in total. So that's an interesting one. To move on about getting ready for and being compliant with NIS2 specifically, Joe, we've done a few cyber incident response cases together. We've probably done a ransomware together where we've helped the client through that situation. It's incredibly tense and incredibly nasty experience for anyone to go through. But what does being ready for NIS2 instant reporting actually look like? When something goes wrong and under pressure, how does that look?
So the kind of reporting that one has to do under NIS2 is not a million miles away from the pre-existing NIS reporting, albeit that was quite underutilized and actually, because of the way in which the sectors were quite narrow under NIS, not that one wouldn't see that many reports as a specialist in any given year. The breadth of this means that there'll be a lot more reporting, and there's a real shift in terms of if you are experiencing a very serious incident, you may have to make kind of very high level early reports. You'll have to follow up with, you may have to be reporting within 24 hours in some contexts, and with further reports following off within 72 and a final report in a month. So there's a bigger kind of burden. It's a more of a dialogue with your national regulator than it's necessarily you might be used to, particularly if you've put in a report to a data protection regulator and sort of several days later just said no case to answer here, off you go on your merry way. It's a bit more intensive than that. The sort of situation that we often find with reporting is it sort of takes people by surprise. They're not familiar with the forms, they don't really know how the process works, even though you may, because NIS2 is all about having kind of risk assessment processes and governance in place. It's not really about technology at all. If you were to legislate for this is the kind of cybersecurity tech you should have, that law would be immediately out of date 3 months later. So there'd be no point in putting that into law. Instead, you just say you've got to be really good at it, have the really be state of the art or ahead of it. And they're more interested in governance frameworks and structures and making sure that people have plans, that they have, as Craig's already said, supplier vetting and all of these things. You can't. It will be very challenging to make an initial report within 24 hours, even the very limited amount of detail that covers, if you don't understand who are your suppliers, what's the situation, have they been vetted, where is the risk coming from. So in order to actually be able to properly meet all the reporting obligations, you need to have actually in advance thought of, you need to have lists of who are our suppliers, who you may also at the same time, by the way, be reporting under multiple bits of legislation. So it's not enough to say we're reporting under NIS2. We'll still be reporting to the data regulator. If you're not an EU-based data regulator, a data process with a one-stop shop option, if you're a UK-based company, you could be reporting to the ICO and lots of other EU regulators, because you don't just get to pick one. So you might be making dozens of reports, and you're going to need to make sure therefore that you know which lawyers in which countries are going to help you do this. You can do it by yourself if you want to, but I really wouldn't recommend it. You need to know where do the forms go? Can they be digitally submitted? Is there a particular portal that I use, or can I email them a document, which a couple of them still allow? Are we going to say exactly the same thing in every country? Or do we need to adapt these things? And actually, you can't prepare all of this in advance because you don't know what the incident is you're reporting, but you can prepare some of it. You can have a certain amount pre-populated and ready to go. What's the entity details? What's its registration number? Who's the DPO? All of these things are going to be true whatever you're reporting. So just have them ready. Don't let that hold up the process. But it's stressful. It's really difficult to get this right. We don't really know how much leeway the reporting authorities are going to give, and it won't be consistent. So we might well see that some reporting authorities, if you're reporting after 36 hours, not 24, they're not particularly bothered. We might see that the Bavarian regulators, one of the regulators gets incredibly tough and starts throwing out fines around this. We're still in a very early stage, so I think we're all going to have to adopt a better safe than sorry approach and prioritize this. It is something that you can prepare for.
Trying to do all that, Joe, whilst you don't have access to your emails when you're locked out of the file system, is only going to fan the flames. So should this process be tested and scenario tested, and who should be involved in that?
Yeah, well, you've probably, Oliver, remembering my top tip to all of my clients, which is, for the love of all that's holy, please print out a copy of your breach response plan. Please print out a list of your team members who are part of your incident response team with their phone numbers, ideally their personal phone numbers, on there, and have a copy at your desk and a copy at home. Because if you can't access your systems, it will take you an astonishing amount of time to pull all of that together. Yes, hard copies are my very low-tech number one piece of advice at all times. And this is one of the top tips I always give when we're doing breach simulation exercises. So you can do these yourself. You can get external people in. I do those, but you can also do those more on the technical side, where you pick a scenario, someone picks a scenario for you, and you test your plan. Right, this has happened at this time. This person's on holiday. Who's the next person on this? So you really run through if who's going to be in this team, who's going to be taking point on which issue, what happens if it gets into the press, what happens if clients start phoning, and you work out, okay, do we have enough people in this team? Do we have enough resource? Who are our external providers? Do we have engagement letters already in place with our external lawyers, our external IT forensic people? Do we have crisis PR communication specialists available if we need them? them? What are their phone numbers? How can we get hold of them? Are we on retainer with them? So the simple fact of instructing people that you've never met before and putting in place engagement letters and providing them with KYC information if they need to set you up as a client, you know, you can lose days doing that. And when there's no need to, you can prep all of this stuff and then you can walk through a test to see how robust it is. I've never done one of these simulation exercises where we didn't make significant changes to the plan and sometimes the team as well. And I will say that quite often you have a team of, and everyone's going to have to forgive me, but lovely senior middle-aged men who are all great and experienced business professionals. And then you get through the process and you realize that none of them know how to access the HR system. They put in place a kind of a text process to contact all of their employees if systems go down, but none of them know how to access it. No one knows who are the details of the PR people, what's going on. So you need to make sure you've got the right people in the room, and the right people isn't just the most senior people. You need to cover off a number of things, and you need to trust that certain people with particular specialisms, even if they're not at C-suite level, need to be there perhaps more than you do, random director who doesn't really cover this that much. So thinking about that, at the end of that process, and sometimes it does take going through that sort of walkthrough simulation process for some people to think, oh, yeah, maybe I don't need to be in the core response group. Somebody else should be subbed in with a better skill set.
Interesting. I did have a chat with a client a while back that said they only will put ex-military personnel within their core response team for cyber incident response because they know what to do under that pressured environment, whereas potentially senior execs that haven't been in that scenario before.
I'm not sure you necessarily need to be ex-military to be capable of responding under high pressure circumstances. But I mean, great for them if they've got so many military veterans that they can sub them all into their team. I'm sure that's great hiring on their part.
Where do, Joe, just come back to you again, just to unpick something you sort of touched upon there. Where do legal expectations and technical reality most often collide during a live cyber incident? And is it, if you're putting aside the point of the need to understand what happened and points of entry, where's the friction point? And Craig, I'm going to come to you as well after this because I think you'll have an opinion on that. But where do you find that, Joe? Where legal and technical most collide?
Yeah, I mean, over time, I find, and again, this is a function of experience. Tensions are less and less because you can plan the tension away. So you can say, right, I'm going to be your lawyer. You need to copy me into everything. I need to have an engagement letter in place with your forensic IT people so that we're hopefully preserving privilege in some of that reporting that they're going to send you. The challenge is kind of speed, and often it's not necessarily that there's a big friction between the technical side and the legal. Often it's the client care and the legal that I find is the really tense point. We need to make sure that we're focusing on the right things and we're getting the right evidence collated, and we're focusing. There can be a challenge where we really need to make sure that we've worked out what's happened and that we aren't doing something in our recovery that's, say, damaging our logs and something or something along those lines, which can happen. But actually sometimes everyone just wants a really quick and dirty way to get back up and running again, because that's Craig was talking about the incredible cost per minute of downtime, and sometimes there is a bit of a tension there. I think often as a lawyer you just have to suck it up, because ultimately you're going to be working within the reality of the business, and the business needs to be operating, and everything else is not only bad for cash flow, it's bad for morale, it's bad for PR, it's bad for everything. So you might as a lawyer have to accept certain limitations on what you would ideally like to see, which is beautiful evidence preservation and everything being mothballed for 3 weeks whilst you investigate. You can't have that. I find the bigger challenge is that there will be a desire to say something to customers, or there will be a desire not to say anything to customers for longer than you ought to. Finding that sweet spot, making sure you have enough information to give them meaningful updates and meaningful disclosure, but that you're not causing undue alarm, or particularly, you know, when you're talking about things that include personal data, that you're not making reports to lots of data subjects, lots of customers, when, you know, without sufficient information to help them to take whatever precautionary measures they need to take. So working out the lines, but it's often the kind of the comms piece and legal where I find a bit more tension, because everyone wants to do the right thing, but there are sometimes competing priorities there. And, you know, the instinct to share or to hold back is not always aligned with what actually is, you know, the reality of the legal position and you know, where we are at that moment.
Craig, just to expand upon that from a technical perspective, where there's a reporting requirement under these regulations, what should firms have in place around evidence gathering or log retention? You know, how should firms be thinking about incident reporting when designing a security system? So obviously systems are in place to try and stop this from happening, but also should companies be thinking about, and how should companies be thinking about, okay, if we do get breached, if this happens, how are we going to investigate it? What should firms be thinking about from that perspective?
Sure. So obviously, you know, preparation is key, right? I think Joe touched quite firmly on this, that you need to have your plan in place, and it needs to be tested and tweaked and modified, and something's changed, and you know, you might not think about that until the time happens. But it's so much easier to do these things ahead of an attack than scrambling during the fog of war trying to get these things done. Yeah. So if you're doing a kind of like a tabletop exercise, walking through simulations, that you know, it really needs to be done. Preparation is key for all of this. Making sure that, you know, the communication within the business and everybody's aligned. Making sure, you know, you might meet that 24-hour reporting obligation, but you might fall under DORA or some other obligations as well, that they have different timelines but need the same information but slightly different. So you might need a system that would be able to manage that, and be able to sit and play to know that, you know, these are your responses, this is how it's adapted for each body you've got to report to, and you know, it can automatically be done, because at the end of the day, having something organized up front is a lot easier than doing it during an attack.
Joe, just come back to you on enforcement, on the enforcement risk. How real is the enforcement risk in the near term, and what should organisations really expect from the regulators? You've touched upon, you know, you mentioned 10 million, you mentioned 2% of turnover. What does it look like, and is it going to be a deferred prosecution agreement, as we've seen in other situations, or has this got teeth? And what could be the enforcement?
Yeah, well, the easier one to talk about first is the Cyber Resilience Act, because there will be some mandatory reporting requirements, so mandatory reporting of exploited vulnerabilities, and requirements under that will come into place in September of this year, and it will not be until December the following year that all of the requirements around products, so CE marking products, which, believe it or not, you can CE mark software. Even if you don't have a physical product, you will have to do that. So those are not until later of next year. But the NIS2 requirements are already largely enforced now. There are some challenges around NIS2, as I mentioned. Not every country has transposed, and of those that do, there are different deadlines for different things, unfortunately. So if you need to register as a critical entity, either because you've been designated or because you think you obviously fall into scope, then those deadlines are going to be looming quite large right now. So Germany's, I think, is coming up in March in 3 or 4 weeks, and I think they're the first. Possibly, actually, I tell a lie. I think Hungary is ahead of the game there. So you know, there may already be some reporting requirements. And failure to report, I suspect, is the first area in which we'll see enforcement, and I think that will be treated quite seriously. So I expect that actually The type of enforcement we'll see in terms of fines for non-compliance in a kind of a breach or just an audit context will not be dissimilar to GDPR type fines. And I think, you know, it's not necessarily the case that there'll be lots of them forthcoming and they'll be enormous. But I do think that failure to register where there is a registration requirement will be treated quite seriously, because you know, those registration requirements are new. They haven't really, you know, existed for most of these businesses outside, you know, in normal operating procedures before, and so the regulators will be quite keen to make some examples of businesses. Now, they will go for the most obvious ones first, so it's not necessarily the case that we're going to see a whole slew of businesses in sort of in the iGaming or adjacent kind of sectors being captured up, because, you know, they will kind of be more of the sort of second, third wave. But if there's a possibility that after listening to all of this you think, oh, I might be in scope, I better check, I would crack on and do it, because you know, even if you are a bit late to meet your registration requirements, that will definitely be better. If you can demonstrate you're at least going through the process of thinking about it, that's going to be big mitigation for you compared to if you've just, you know, not really engaged with the process. I think we will, you know, these are going to be regulatory fines, so you know, we are going to see, for the most part, they will just be issued. We're not going to see an awful lot of kind of plea bargains or deals, you know, we'll defer this fine if we get this in order. By and large, these are similar, if not in every case, but the designated regulators are often the data protection regulators. They don't really care. They'll issue a fine if they like, and yeah, they will factor in whether or not it's going to bankrupt you, and might adjust it slightly accordingly. But they want these fines to hurt, and they will be quite determined to make sure that it impacts on the bottom line in a significant fashion. So I don't think that we can rest too much on our laurels here.
And just to add to that quickly, obviously I mentioned Malta before, but you know, self-registration deadline has already passed for essential entities. That was, you know, back in September 25, and governance controls actually in place by March 26 as well. And then there's the ultimate sanction of the MGA license being suspended if you know, if a particular iGaming firm that falls under this falls foul. So, you know, if you've got an API that's, you know, supplying 60% of licensed operators in Malta, then you will fall under this category, and it's worth, you know, taking advice on that straight away. And it becomes an existential threat, because obviously, if you lose your license, you can't operate, you can't make money, and you know, it becomes more important than product development and marketing and anything else that you may be doing.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Malta has been very specific in particular in terms of its focus on iGaming, and I think the fact that it is, you know, iGaming gambling as a sector isn't specifically called out in NIS2. It's very helpful that Malta has been as explicit as it has in terms of like gold plating the EU regulation to add in these additional penalties and or incentives, we might say, for people to get their act together, because I think it really will flag up to a lot of organisations that might otherwise have missed it, that they need to do something about this.
Great. I've tried to weave in as many questions as I could from attendees. So if you do have anything else to ask, we've got a couple of minutes left. And you can submit questions within the webinar software on the question tab. Just to wrap up, Joe, if I go to you first. What one or two takeaway actions should people prioritize in the next 90 days? And what should they focus on in light of this discussion today?
I'm going to give one small technical thing, not that small for everyone, but I think Craig touched on this a little bit earlier, but one of the things that that's become a recurring theme that I've noticed is open source software becoming a problem here, particularly in the context of the Cyber Resilience Act. There was a big push by OSS kind of developers to exempt open source software from the provisions of the CRA, because it's you know, their view is it's not a commercial thing, but of course open source software is used widely commercially and developed for, you know, for quasi-commercial uses all the time, and so there's a big challenge around, if you are using open source software, you are still responsible for all of the same requirements around cybersecurity, around making sure that you are pushing out updates. If you have we have an obligation if we're producing an application or a product that falls in the scope of the CRA to ensure that we're pushing out updates for the reasonable life of the product, which has a minimum of 5 years. Now, it's really hard to manage an update process if you didn't draft the code, but you have to find a way of doing it. So if you're heavily reliant on OSS, like, focus on that and take some advice on it and think about what you're going to do, would be piece number one. Broader piece number two is print off those incident response plans, as I said, and organize some form of simulation exercise, even if it's just a sort of a quick and dirty, we're going to spend 2 hours running through this as a group. Get going with it. You will find some things that can be improved, and you can then have a broader scale compliance effort if you need one, but it's a really good way to kick things off. It gets a lot of conversation started. It throws a lot of things up into daylight. So that would be my top tip. If you are looking at all of this going, there are so many things to do, there are so many compliance exercises and different compliance things. It's like, start with something practical, get everyone going, and then work from there.
Right, great. Craig, same question to you. Just 1 or 2 takeaways that people should prioritize over the next couple of months.
Yeah, so just to reiterate what Joe said about the SBOM, the software bill of materials. So you've got to have every library, every open source component, every module in there, like an ingredients list, as I mentioned before, but not just for the software that you're doing, but for your partners as well, for people that integrate with you. And you need to you're ultimately responsible as an operator for their code. So you've really got to make sure that you do your background checks, and that's very important too. So there's that, but also making sure you've got training on staff training, whether it's board members or otherwise. And MFA is another big one, where MFA has to be in everything these days, especially with privilege executions and everything. It needs to be there. So, and also that falls on your suppliers as well. So anybody you partner with, MFA all the way. Oh, that rhymes. That's a good tag. And yeah, basically looking at your ingredients list, that makes up your software, and that's somewhere that's a good start.
Great. Yes, please, Joe. Yeah.
Sorry, I was going to say, can I kind of add one thing that I think underlies everything that we've been talking about today, but that we haven't specifically called out, which is culture. It's like everyone's like, oh, culture, it's not a real thing. Stop saying it, Joe. And I've been banging on this drum for the GDPR as well for many years, so I appreciate it sounds a bit nauseating. But if you have particularly like a no blame culture, if you have a world in which people can call out bugs and issues and concerns and vulnerabilities, where they can talk about what for some reason the MFA has dropped off this, or I don't think we've got, I think there's too many permissions here. There are so many specific and practical things that both NIS2 and the CRA throw up that I think you can get very bogged down in the detail. But actually, if you can do anything at all, it's look at your culture and work out what can we do to make it more open, more engaged, where people feel that it's their responsibility and that they're happy to put their hand up and call out a problem. Because if you can't get that, then you can try and fix all of these things, but it'll never really gel, and you'll still have quite a painful process as and when something goes wrong.
Yeah, great point to end on there, Joe. Really super important as well. I'm going to say I enjoyed the session. I thought it was fascinating, although some parts I'm sure people are slightly terrified and realise there's a lot to tackle. Joe, how can people get hold of you after this? Because I'm sure they'll have some more questions to ask, and maybe some support. How can people get hold of you, Joe?
Absolutely. I, as I'm sure is true of you two gentlemen, I'm always happy to chat to people with specific questions afterwards. I don't pop the clock on the minute you phone me, so don't panic. I think you can find me on LinkedIn. You can find me on joe.joyce@taylorwessing.com, and stalk me on any platform you choose. If I'm there, drop me a message and I will gladly get back to you.
Wonderful, thanks. And Craig, how do people get hold of you?
Yeah, of course. I mean, LinkedIn is the favourite and easiest. Obviously, Craig Lusher. Obviously, craig.lusher@content8.com is my email as well. So feel free to reach out. Happy to help talk through any problems you have.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Really enjoyed this conversation, and we'll close the webinar now. Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.